mean, I probably found this one a bit easier because, like Sarah, there's a couple of things that hit me in the face. I work in local government, that's my sector, and where I organise as a trade unionist. So I thought there were two things actually that would be important to see in a national climate service for local government workers, possibly a crossover for people in health as well, but in public service, I guess. One is about care service, actually, because I found it quite shocking. 84% of residential care home beds are run by private contractors, even though over half of those residents have their care paid for by local authorities. So your local authority, for instance, loads of local authorities have got a climate action plan, which is great, you know, they declare the climate emergency and have a climate action plan. You then try and hold them to account to put it into practice, and you can get so far because, of course, private companies, those contractors don't have to have a climate emergency plan. As you rightly said, they don't have to pay for the cost, you know, they don't have to make any sort of payback for the impact of what they do. But even if they did have to have a climate emergency plan, I'm sure you can imagine how, if they were left to decarbonise themselves, actually what they will probably do is charge huge amounts to the NHS and to local authorities, to councils, which is precisely why we need public ownership to be part of tackling the climate emergency, and to allow us to control the ability to do that, and indeed to adapt to new developments as they go on in, or you know, different aspects of care and other things that the public sector does. So I think the care, you know, having thought about what kind of care service we would have, and I mean, one of Unison's campaigns is for a national care service, but I think that has to have running through it where that sits with the National Climate Service as well. The other thing that I thought should be included is retrofitting and addressing, you know, addressing buildings, I suppose, is the only way to talk about that, because that's such a huge project. But again, when you think about local councils, it's something really, really relevant to them, because if you think about the number of skilled, trained workers that you would need to do this across just one council. You know, in Camden we've got 35,000 council homes, never mind the public buildings. You know, there's 3 million hospitals, there's, you know, however many council buildings that aren't hospitals, never mind looking at private buildings and all the rest of it. So you think of what we need as a workforce to address that. Even as a local authority, it can't be done piecemeal. Never mind looking at a city or indeed a country or globally. So there has to be planning and thoughts and funding and training put into all of that. And again, if you imagine if it was left to the hands of private companies, they would just look at how they could be making a profit out of that as their priority, not about, you know. So retrofitting has to happen, let's say for council homes, but is it done in a way that makes, I don't know, the equivalent of Balfour Beatty get even richer, or is it done in a way that, and of course how they get rich is by subcontracting, so that the person who actually does the work gets paid a pittance, has no rights, has to work long hours, which means there's mistakes, which means it doesn't work, which means the council has to go back in and pay and do it again to make it work. And you know, so you end up with things being paid for 2 or 3 times, with poorly paid workers carrying them out, and you know, the construction companies making money out. Here, direct labour base, if you like, the works depot. So we're arguing before they get those plans done, before they decide how it needs to be, they have to look at the future of what kind of work they'll be doing about the retrofitting. Therefore, it needs to be of a scale where they can take on, you know, hundreds of apprentices who are trained up into proper jobs with proper qualifications to do the retrofitting type work. So you have to have the space to do it, you have to have the equipment to do it, you have to have the educators to do it, and you know, that would mean obviously a huge expansion. And of course, the argument that we're coming up against is that that requires the money, and we're having to then turn that around to be, and that's why, particularly as a Labour council, you have to be publicly leading a campaign and an argument for the proper funding of public services, because unless you get it kind of that way round, you're not going to address what we need to make the climate, a national climate service a reality. We're going to keep repeating that cycle of, you know, making the climate emergency worse, and indeed people's lives worse, people's jobs worse, without putting those challenge. So I thought, I think that's an important thing, you know, certainly nationally, to address. But, you know, I thought that was probably quite a good little example of what we're trying to do. Whether or not we'll do it, of course, is a different matter. But I think if we had taken up certainly across London in councils, we would have quite a chance of getting something like that to happen. But it does require planning and I think a national climate service.
Thanks, Liz. I think that's a really good practical example, because obviously we're not going to be able to wait for a kind of big boom moment. Here's the National Climate Service, kind of what we did with the National Health Service, and there's ways to start pushing for this already. John, I'm going to bring you in last. So I thought you might want to come back on points, so just to warn you. So I will go to, I think I'll go to Sarah next.
Thanks, Sam. So the way that I looked at this was, to get to a national climate service, we need a strategy to get there. And representing workers in the food industry that plays a significant role both in contributing to climate change, as I mentioned this morning, but also being impacted by its effects. Any strategy to get to a service at the end of its national must prioritise actions that not only mitigate emissions, but also ensure that there's resilience and sustainability of food production systems, whilst obviously safeguarding workers' rights and livelihoods. So we need to have policies within there that promote sustainable agricultural practices, reduce carbon footprints of food production and distribution, which includes support for transitioning towards kind of regenerative agriculture, which, you know, utilises the carbon in the soil but enhances biodiversity and resilience to extreme weather events, and additionally investing in ecological, I struggle with getting that out, methods that can empower farmers to adapt to climate change, whilst reducing reliance on chemical inputs and monocultural farming that we've seen so much of over the last as long as I've been alive, which are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. We would need a national climate service to address the issue of food waste as well, and I know we touched on that, because that accounts for a significant portion of global emissions. Implementing measures to reduce food waste, not just at like the end. There's some great work doing around supermarkets, particularly in France, but throughout the supply chain from field to fork, so that then emissions are mitigated whilst also alleviating pressure on natural resources and reducing hunger and food insecurity as well. And you know, you could look at things like standardised date labelling, or removing it altogether, improved storage and transportation infrastructure, and consumer education campaigns, which comes back to using less rather than just buying for the sake of it. And then another kind of critical aspect to consider is the transition to a low carbon and resilient food system. So that would require investment in renewable energy, sustainable transportation, energy efficient technologies within the food industry, which actually can move across different sectors, not just food. And, you know, incentivising the adoption of renewable energy sources. The food industry is the biggest manufacturing unit in the UK, but it's the lowest when it comes to government investment. The point you was making about like financial penalties, actually it could be an incentive that way as well. You know, you need to get this done, otherwise you're going to be financially penalised for not acting quick enough or meeting targets. Promoting energy efficient measures, and we've done a bit of that in our union around trying to share best practice within different companies, and then reducing emissions from food processing, packaging and transportation, whilst creating green jobs and stimulating economic growth. Obviously, I know it should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, we must prioritise the wellbeing and rights of workers throughout the supply chain. This includes ensuring fair wages, safe working conditions and opportunities for training and career advancement, and additionally efforts to transition towards kind of a climate service that in the food industry would mean that the food system must be inclusive and equitable, taking into account needs and perspective of marginalised workers, including migrant labourers and small-scale farmers that are often unseen because of the way that the farms are set up and the visas are manufactured. And then, alongside a strategy to get to where we want as an end game, we obviously need to build support for these measures, and that's going to be not just talking to us in this room that are kind of already bought in, because that's why we're here, but other stakeholders as well, including, organisations like the NFU, which is typically seen as quite a right-wing organisation, farmers, and have always been seen as kind of the ones that push for Brexit, the very right-wing, but you can see over the last few months, they are also now kind of seeing and feeling the impact of climate change and not necessarily looking at it from the same angle as we would in this room, but we've definitely got an opportunity to kind of talk to them and work with them and work together to do something different going forwards, and getting them on board with what essentially would support us all, whatever sector we're in going forwards, because the more people that buy into it, the more people that are pushing for it, the more chance that it will be successful.
Brilliant, that's great. Yeah, I think it's a really important point about, the kind of invisible workers as well, because obviously we tend to talk about, the trade union movement and organised labour, but the majority of workers are not organised in the sense of trade union. It doesn't mean they're not organised at all. Les, I'm going to come back to you now for your second part.
Right, so for the question, what should the new body, National Climate Service, include as important to your sector, and in my case, higher education? So the NCS serves as a shorthand for a state body that facilitate and fund initiatives for a just transition. It would help to link various organizations, especially trade unions. They can include the climate as a popular mainstream issue for bargaining and organizing, as is already happening in the higher education sector. Its trade unions, that is UCU and Unison, have put a Green New Deal into our national joint claims. UCU now has branch green reps, regional green officers, and a national advisory committee, in which I take part, which propose motions for conferences by the union at all levels. Its recent meeting approved a motion against the UK arms trade as a climate destroyer, among many examples. To promote climate justice for a just transition, the higher education sector can play several roles. Most obviously, staff can promote a low-carbon transition within their own university. They can do public education about the contentious political issues, as we heard in the comments from almost everybody in the previous round here. More ambitiously, higher education staff have interdisciplinary skills. They can help develop institutional capacities necessary for a just transition more widely across all economic sectors. This means linking several elements: socially useful work, employment security, solidaristic relationships, and lower resource burdens. Such efforts could create or revive commons, that is, capacities and material resources which are collectively managed by a community of some kind, novel kinds of community. All of this would need new institutional forms. Higher education staff can facilitate public-public partnerships, that is, between local authorities, trade unions, community groups, workers' cooperatives, and social enterprises. And higher education staff can help design policies which restructure markets for those aims, contrary to the dominant neoliberal form. As a case study, I refer to Glasgow's conflicts around how to retrofit houses. I mean, the example that Liz gave more generally. And I emphasize Glasgow because it has an unusually well-funded program thanks to devolution through the Scottish Government, but it's also contentious, so we can draw lessons from it. In 2021, the Scottish Government announced funds for the Glasgow City region to retrofit homes and substitute renewable energy systems for natural gas. The funds were meant for jointly addressing fuel poverty, heat efficiency, and decarbonisation. But the commitment was given only through 2026. According to a retrofit program manager, quote, the short-term funding does not give businesses the long-term confidence of a multi-year pipeline that will encourage the expansion of investment in the skills of their staff and manufacturing capacity, nor did it incentivize workers to do the retraining necessary to carry out retrofitting in a good quality way. Even worse, the program set a minimal standard, Energy Performance Certificate Level C, which might soon become obsolete. Why such a low standard? Because this simplifies competitive tendering, the wider neoliberal framework which has shaped the retrofit program and all the policies of Glasgow City Council. This creates competition among organisations that instead could cooperatively innovate improvements and raise standards. According to a housing association, which I quote, the funding is allocated through a bidding process, which means that we are competing against other organizations with which we might cooperate. In fact, range for long supply chains through port expertise and many from where socialized market is suggested. Scottish Trade Congress led a multi-stakeholder proposal for a whole house retrofit approach for decarbonizing heat in homes with the slogan, Our Climate, Our Homes. This would cooperatively expand and combine expertise from several groups, including trade unions. This would need an alternative form of market, partly through different rules on public procurement. But such an alternative has been precluded by Glasgow's neoliberal policy. If you want to know more on this, see my blog piece on the website of Scott 3E. So in sum, a new state body would help to stimulate and finance solidaristic multi-stakeholder cooperation. This would contest neoliberal policies and develop alternatives through new organizational forms. I'll conclude there.
Brilliant, thank you. And bring up the organisational form, different forms of ownership, which Sarah mentioned first time. So, Jenny, back to you.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, hearing everybody's comments is sort of developing my own thinking out live. Yeah, so there's been great examples there. There's about housing and the kind of things that need to happen. I think one of the things about that was probably again from looking at things from a regional perspective is every region in this country has a slightly different nation, has a slightly different setup in terms of governance and all institutions and organisations, and it's really hard to kind of say this is how you should do things in a region. So I like that devolution of ours is helpful, but it's very hard to generalise really about what can happen. In Yorkshire and Humber, we've been lucky to have the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, which has helped to bring together different sectors, and there's been a trade union voice very strongly embedded in that, and thanks largely to my former boss, Phil Adams, and the work he did with the regional secretary in Yorkshire and Humber. And Sarah's been someone who's been at lots of those meetings. So there's been kind of those voices around the table and coming to a consensus. The interesting thing is, it's like with climate assemblies, when you actually sit down and you have an intelligent conversation about a lot of these ideas actually are what comes out of it. Because, for instance, if you want to do retrofit and you want to do it in a time scale, you have to solve those skills problems that Sam mentioned. You have to actually have teams that collaborate, instead of having the insulator go in and then the electrician go in and wreck everything you insulated it. It's like you have to actually work in collaborative ways and train people
there's a huge skills gap in retrofit right across the country, and you know the things are not going. Things need to be done, let's say, right first time, because there's no point in a climate emergency doing half the job and then leaving the rest for another 5 years. You need to do it. You need to do it right now. But you know, again, it's like about getting these real bread and butter everyday economy issues up the agenda. And another example has been around, that people haven't mentioned so much, has been around transport. So the lack of outside London, I don't know if any of you ever go outside London, but things are a bit desperate in the bus world. And George, who's here, is an activist in Best Buses South Yorkshire. Basically, everything's been deregulated for many, many years, and there are now potential powers for bringing public transport back under public control, which is only common sense and only what's always been done in London. So that, you know, somebody like the mayor actually says, oh, we need these timetables, this frequency, these fares, this quality of buses, you know, they're going to be electric or whatever, and actually says, then, you know, which of these private companies has prepared to bid for this work. That's franchising. We could have complete public control and public ownership as well. That would be a further step. But franchising would just be like sanity that no other city in the world would go down the route that we've gone down with deregulation. So campaigning has really helped to push things in South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire particularly, to get our mayors to actually grasp the nettle and say, yes, we will go down the franchising route with, they're both seriously advanced on that now. And unions can play and have played in Yorkshire a role in that. You know, if unions get behind those campaigns, it makes those campaigns stronger. But obviously there are issues that need teasing out, about what happens to the jobs in the bus depots, what happens to the drivers, who are they employed by, what will their job look like, will they still have the same conditions or better conditions. So, it really needs a lot of detailed work. And it's where does this detailed work happen between the people who are driving the kind of climate campaigns and the unions who are, really understand the needs of the workers. Sometimes bringing universities in can really help with that. I think in the Climate Commission in Yorkshire and Humber, that has been another strong feature, is that it gives us access to that sort of top-level research and credibility of actually saying what should happen and forming a consensus. But universities are mostly locked away behind paywalls and very difficult to access and won't do anything unless you pay them. So you need to find the people, perhaps through UCU, find the people in the universities who can help, who want to help, who are climate activists, who want to make this happen. And that, to some extent, we have managed to make happen. Stop our mayors and local governments being kind of hypnotised by things like, Rolls-Royce or, big companies or airports or whatever, and actually unpack, where really are the jobs here? Where are the climate impacts? And how do we actually make our own transition plan, involve workers in those, and actually say, this is what the industry needs, and the workers in it are experts in that. Just to shout out for Linda Clark at Westminster University, who's done lots of really great work on retrofit, and our trainees can be involved in public-led schemes. She's here at this conference, I've seen her, so great person to get in touch with about direct labour organisations, how that kind of thing can work. And really just coming back to the strong values of education and strong values of internationalism that unions have always had, and making connections, talking to each other, developing those, the work life around, how can we actually change what's happening with coal extraction in DRC? Where are the levers we can pull? What are the powers we can use? Using legal powers wherever we can to address those things. Yeah, and just another shout out for the work of my colleague Sam Perry in Humber, using Humber, who's doing work around local authorities and climate bargaining in the workplace. And he's also at Scotland, so any chance you get to have a chat with Sam. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Linda's actually speaking in the next session, next set of workshops, so Sarah again. Thank you, Sarah. So now I go to you, John.
Thanks, Mike. The idea of the climate change service grew out of the recognition that the UK civil service is fundamentally incapable of delivering just transition, just transformation. The work is fragmented between different departments, there's no overall plan, there's no overall long-term funding, etc., etc. Once we started talking about the civil service, then automatically, well, it seems to me automatically, we started to talk about the state more generally, the state in all its various guises, either actually existing parts of the state such as councils, mayors, obviously the devolved governments, but also potentially other forms of the state in terms of regional different structures. I mean, when you look at Britain, it's, I know people say it's the most centralised state in the whole of Western Europe, but when you actually drill down, it is actually very variated. It might be under a very directive central organisation, i.e. the UK government, but actually there's lots of different bits. And if we're going to deliver just transformation, and I do like that notion, because obviously in just transition, in theory, you could just justly transit to what exists now. So, for instance, you could say to rail companies, supposedly all private, it's more complicated than that, and we'll just transition and they'll still be in place. In other words, there'll still be Great Western Railways who won't get me to my destination, or South West Rail who won't get me to the destination, or North East Rail who won't get me to destination. In other words, you could just literally keep the existing economy, but actually just transition in a certain way to basically what exists now. Certainly my union's policy is to actually look at what I think would be better termed just transformation, is a different type of economy. Now that's a wider debate obviously, but we certainly see as part of that different types of ownership, and certainly we don't believe that actually just transition, just transformation is probably capable without a change of not only state, not only a change of political will, but even of a change of ownership models. So we're in favour of the socialisation of the energy market, the transport corporations, etc. We do that, and again coming back, we just don't want to actually scrub out the name and say you're a public servant now, but you'll still have all the perks, the hierarchies, etc. The trade unions will have more of a say. You know, we'll meet them more regularly now because we're nationalised. We want to have a fundamentally different actual form of ownership. And that does devolve not only every part of the state, so councils are vitally important because they deliver and can deliver on a local basis the national plan. So we're talking about retrofitting. Clearly, I mean, on the face of it, retrofitting should be the simplest thing in the world to do. It's not a complicated issue. What is complicated, as the colleague has said, that you try to use existing mechanisms, you actually fall on the wayside of there's lack of skills, you fall on the way of we have to do competitive tendering, you fall on the way we have to fragment the implementation through hundreds and hundreds and thousands of different companies, where in fact actually a local council could just set up a direct labour organisation, go to the local health education authority where they still exist in any meaningful sense, and say we need 500 apprentices, can you set up a course over the next 10 years, and then that's it. I mean, on the face of it, it's very easy. In reality, it's very difficult because every political party just accepts what is as what must be. Whereas I think the whole point of the National Climate Change Service is that we can start to think in a more fundamental way of what we have to change in order to deliver what we're looking for. I think as part and parcel of that, democracy is vitally important, not only in the sense that obviously in local councils you can boot out councillors, etc., but also I think we all, or certainly my union, would want a much more democratically driven state at all levels, where literally citizens genuinely had real rights. I mean, just take a simple thing, the Freedom of Information Act. Freedom of Information Act, well, you might remember that Tony Blair claimed it was the worst mistake he ever made. So, Iraq, Freedom of Information Act. Iraq, freedom. I have to be honest, I think Iraq was a much better, worse mistake, Tony, than the Freedom of Information Act. But what he meant by it is that he didn't realise that citizens might use it, or more accurately, media might use it to criticise him. And the Conservatives have thought about, can we curtail it, and they've been held off. But clearly, if we had a much better Freedom of Information Act in this country, which is burdensome for public servants and civil servants, but nevertheless it has potentially transformative. If that was extended to private companies, if that was extended to everybody who delivered a public service, albeit even if they're a private company, I'm not claiming it's utterly transformative, but it would actually be a step forward in being a much more transparent state. So I do think we have to look at this as part of a wider project of democratisation. Last but not least, the role of trade unions. Clearly they're vital, because one, they're a democratic structure. Look, I am not claiming that every union is utterly democratic and the most democratic. My union is a very imperfect democracy, so I'm not trying to pretend. However, it's better than any private company that I know of. You can still boot out the top person maybe every 5 years or whatever, but you still have that opportunity. You can still put pressure on the leadership in a way that clearly you can't do as an individual employee of a company. Also, trade unions know a tremendous amount about their industries. They actually know what works. They actually know what doesn't work. And also, they allow, if you like, the grassroots to influence them in order for them to influence the industries they're in. So I would want to see, as part and parcel of this, not that they get fused into the state in some sort of like Stalinist way, where HR is just another term for trade unionism, but nevertheless we have real rights. And one of those rights I think we definitely need, and I'll finish on this, is around strikes. Coming back to it, the anti-trade union laws are a real impediment in a democratic society for trade unions to democratically actually protest and strike against not only sort of economic things but political things. Unions should be allowed to do that. It should be a basic democratic right in any industry that a union should say, we're going to take a strike over the government because we hate the government or whatever. That's what a democracy is. So just to summarise and bring it together, the state is vitally important in all its various forms. To pretend that somehow you can have just transformation without actually involving the state, that somehow private companies can do it, I just don't understand how that's possible. The state is going to give direction, the state is going to give orders, there's no doubt about it. But that state has to be democratically controlled. But also we need mechanisms to join up the plan to make it a living reality, albeit democratically controlled. And that's where I think the Climate Change Service comes in. It's not only a mechanism inside the UK civil service to deliver just transformation, it's also a method by which we actually should look fundamentally at the state, the balance of democracy, etc., because we want to deliver, I would hope, as part of this. And in fact, I think it's getting a certain common currency, and I'll finish on this, is that without a different society, then we will never deliver just transformation. We will deliver, if we don't have that just society, we'll just deliver actually more and more runaway heat in this world, where some people, millions of people, will just die every year, where some places like Karachi in Pakistan will just literally become uninhabitable unless you're very rich and can live in an air-conditioned cocoon. I think this is part and parcel of a wider debate about a different society, but nevertheless I do think it's an important part.
Brilliant, thank you, John. And thanks everybody for the contributions and hopefully lots of food for thought there, but not just